All right, so we're going to go down here to the schedule. And I realized that some of you had a tough week last week, probably went through some things, still probably trying to get fixed this week. So I understand that you might be a little behind. And we had last week, you just had the 2 discussion postings that you may not have gotten done because of things going on in your life. I understand that your Wi-Fi at least was probably on and off. Maybe your power was out. All kind of things going on. Unfortunately, some pipes might have busted, or all kind of things people are having trouble with now. So I'm hoping that things are getting a little back to normal, and that you'll have power now, I guess, and internet connection. But I know that some things are still going on with some people. So I know that you may not have submitted these, but if you could try to get these in as soon as you can, so we don't get too far behind. If you submitted it, I may not have had a chance to grade it, but you can check the comments to see if it says like part 1. I may have just graded part 1 if it doesn't say anything about part 2. So go ahead and try first to get the methods chapter cleared up. That was the discussion where you implement someone else's method. And then you're working on the UML diagram with chapter 6. So do this one first, and then if you haven't done this one, then go ahead and move on to this one with the UML diagram. So then this week, you are supposed to implement someone else's UML diagram. So if we can get this in as soon as possible, then we'll have more diagrams to work from, and then we can do this part 2. But I understand that this might be a little delayed because you might still be working on the UML diagram. Maybe everyone hasn't posted their UML diagram. So I understand that this might be delayed. But let's try and get the chapter exercise done and take the quiz. And then if your assignment's delayed, it's delayed, but I don't want to have it go too much into the other week. So if you're having trouble and you're just not able to get it done, let me know. But let's try. I see that living, huh? I'm making it through, right? Let's try and get what we can done because I don't want to push things into spring break and start delaying things any further because the content is going to get more difficult. So I don't want to still be working on chapter 6 weeks down the road. So let's try and get it done if we can and get moving on it. If you absolutely can't, then let me know. Hey, does anybody have questions?
I have one small question about the discussion activity 3.
Sure.
For the answers for that one, you said that we don't have to provide a driver function to actually create the objects. Is it okay if we do anyways?
That would be perfect.
Okay, great.
Trying to make sure you didn't have too much work, but yes, that would be great. And today we're actually going to do a breakout session where we do that so you can practice that. We're going to create a UML diagram and create a Java class and a driver. So yes, having a driver and testing it would be awesome, but I don't have it as part of the requirement, so you don't have to.
I have one more question about the same activity.
Sure.
So, are we supposed to create a scanner so people can provide input, or we can choose our own values?
You can just choose your own. You can do the scanner if you want to, but you can just create the object choosing your own values and then just do some of the getters to test them to see if they work when you print them
Okay,
out.
so, like just to make it work, right?
Yeah, just the basic testing. You don't have to be too involved.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. All right. Any other questions about chapter 6 that we know what we're doing? I'm gonna go to Kahoot and see how much you know about chapter 6. Did you all get a chance to look over chapter 6 at all?
Yes, I did.
I did.
I did.
Good, good. So while you're reading by candlelight, right?
I actually had a really, really long break at like Friday last week from all the rolling blackouts my area had. So I was able to read a little.
Okay, good, good. I was hoping you can get some reading in there. I know you may not have had power, and you might have been freezing, so that might have played into it. I mean, sitting with your winter gear reading Java is not your #1 priority, but hopefully you got some of it done. So, all right, let's go ahead and see what you know, and we'll go over it and see how it goes. Okay, so let's start our game. And I'm gonna go ahead and, because it's loading, okay. All right, so 771-8419. You can join me. I'm gonna shut this off. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so instance methods do not have the keyword static in their headers. That's true because instance methods are methods that belong with the object, so they're also called object methods. So they don't have the word static because static indicates that you're not working with an object. It's not associated with an object. So I know that word instance is kind of confusing, but when we're talking about an object, they also refer to it an instance. You'll hear some people say that you're instantiating a class. Really, all you're doing is creating an object of a class. So it's a fancy word. Instantiating is a fancy word for creating an object. But then you'll hear people also call it instance. An object is an instance. It's an instance of a class. So object, instance are same thing. So object methods, instant methods do not have the word static in their headers because static indicates that it's not associated with an object. So does that make sense to everybody? You're all good with that?
Yes.
Okay. Go to the next one.
Fuck. Instant fields.
Okay. When an object is created, the attributes associated with the objects are called instance fields. So remember, instance means object. So those are just the fields. Those are the properties, the attributes that go with the object. So instance methods are the methods that go with it. So those are like your setters to set your properties or your attributes, your getters to return the information about those properties. But the fields, you can call them instance variables or instance fields, properties. Those are that's the information that goes with your object. So if you're talking about a person, for example, if you had a person object you're creating, you might have instance fields of like birthday, first name, last name, height, weight, whatever, depending on what you're creating the object for, you might have different instance fields, things that are important information to have about that object. So those instance fields are your variables that store the information about your object. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so a group of related classes is called a package. So a package, those are the folder structure that you put your files into, your classes. And so you group them and you put them in packages, and then you import those packages when you're inside of different packages. So it's good to start grouping things, just like when you have files and you're saving things, you group them into folders, hopefully, and subfolders to help you to categorize things. We do the same thing, except we call that group package. Okay. Okay, the scope of the private instance field is the instant methods of the same class. So whenever you're doing your instance fields, normally you make those fields private. And the reason for that is that you're trying not to directly access those fields from another class. So if you have an object and you make the instance fields for that class public, then you can see the name of the object and you can see the name of the field, and you can modify that field, or you can access it. So normally you don't want people doing that because you have setters and getters to do that. And the reason for having the setters is so that you can have any type of logic in there that you want that might have like validation, for example, for setting the field. And if you had validation in there for setting the field, but you made your fields public, they can change the fields without going through the setter. And so normally we call that data hiding. We're trying to keep the access of those fields from within the class, and so you make them private. So you have to go through setters and getters to access them. And so the private instant fields can only be accessed from the same class. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay. Okay, what does the following UML diagram entry mean? So if you bring this up, this at the plus sign at the beginning means that it's public. If you have a minus sign, that means that it's private. And you want to make your setters public and your getters public so that you can access them, because if you have an object and you made the setters and the getters private in your class, then you wouldn't be able to access them, so they wouldn't do any good. So the purpose of the setters and getters is to be able to retrieve information about the object and to be able to change information about the object. The setters modify the information and the getters return information about it. So you want them to be public. And then when you have a setter, most likely you're going to have to take in data to be able to change the property. So if you're talking about setting a height, you're probably going to have to pass in a height. So there's a double variable in there, h for height, that's going to allow you to set the height. And then this method is going to be void. Now, most of your setters, most of the time, will be void. And the reason is because they're modifying data. They're not actually giving you back any data. So setters, their job is to modify the data, not give you any data back. Now, getters, most of the time, are not going to be void. They're going to be non-void. And depending on what type of data you're talking about, that's what data type you'll get back. But the job of the getters is to return information to you, but the job of the setter is to set the information. Does that make sense to everybody? Public method with parameter type double that doesn't return a value. Everybody okay with that? Any questions? Okay, let's see how you did. Okay. Close that so it's not playing music in the background. All right. So I want to go over to NetBeans and pull up some code for you. But I first want to take a look at this UML diagram that I have here. So this is one of the examples that's in your book, a cell phone. And I wanted to talk about the UML diagram because this is something that you have to do for the discussion board. Some of you already did it, but some of you are still working on it. So the top part is where you're going to put your class name. The class name is going to start with a capital letter, and then every word after that gets a capital, but it should be all one word, okay? So your class name is separated at the top, and then the next thing you have are your instance variables or your instance fields. These are your properties that you have that you think are important for the class that you're creating. So when you create an object, these will be the properties that go with that object. So for a cell phone, for example, manufacturer might be important, model, and price. So manufacturer and model are both strings, and price is a double, you get a decimal number. So these variables, you should normally make them private, but you could make them public, but the minus sign means private. That means that you'll have to change them if you wanted to change them through the setters, not by individually accessing them. Okay? So far, so good?
Yes.
Okay. Then we have something new called a constructor. So a constructor is a method that matches the same name as your class. It has to be exactly the same. So normally methods start with a lowercase letter, but your constructor starts with a capital because your class starts with a capital. So what's the point of the constructor? Well, the constructor is going to be public, so it can be accessed. And the purpose is to normally to set your properties. So instead of, like if you didn't have a constructor here, there'd be a default constructor that doesn't set anything, okay? So you don't have to have a constructor because there's a default empty constructor that doesn't do anything, okay? So if you don't put one on there, it will still work. But the problem is, if you were to create a cell phone object and you didn't set the manufacturer, model, and retail price, then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to see the name of the object and do the setters for every property. Now, I know it's only 3, it's not a big deal, but that's kind of a pain if you're talking about something that had like 10 different things. You might forget to set one of them, and then that doesn't get set. So instead of having to call the setters to set all your properties for your object, if you could just set them in your constructor, and then if you ever need to modify them, you can use the setters to do that. But the purpose of the constructor is to set them when you first create the object so that they have properties. So they have values for everything. So you can see here, the cell phone has the 3 properties, the 3 variables you were talking about up here. It has those 3 variables here. Now they're not the same names because we didn't want to do shadowing and have the same names because that makes it confusing. Because what you're going to do is you're going to take in a value and put it in this variable, and then you're going to set this top level variable here that goes with your object. So you don't want them to have the same name. Okay, you can make it work, but it makes it confusing. If you start doing that, you have to start using the word this when you're talking about the different variables to tell which one you're talking about. Okay, so it makes it a little confusing. So normally you'll have different names here, and then you'll actually say that these variables get assigned to these variables inside the constructor. Or you can call the setter from inside the constructor that does the assigning for you. Okay, and then all of these methods, the setters and getters, will be public. The setters, you can see the 3 setters, they're all void. They're not returning anything. And then they have the data type parameter of what type of data you're taking in. So the manufacturer takes in a string, the model takes in a string, and the retail price takes in a double. Okay? And then your getters, you're not actually having any parameters in those because you're not setting anything, you're not changing anything, you don't need any information from somebody using it. So those are empty, you're just giving them back the data. So you're asking for data in that case. Does everybody understand the layout of the UML diagram?
Yes.
Okay, and try and follow the right capitalization too. Okay, so method names begin with a lowercase letter except for your constructor. Your classes begin with a capital letter. Your variable names begin with lowercase letter. Okay, so let's take a look at the code. So first I'm going to take a look at the cell phone class. That's what we were just looking at the UML diagram for. So I have this cell phone class here, and I have those 3 variables I was talking about. These are your instance variables or instance fields. And you can see that they're all private, and that's so that you can't directly access them. You have to go through a setter to change them or a getter to return the information about them. Okay? And then we talked about this last week. We have these comments in here. It's good to put comments in there. And if you do the /**, this will actually create the Java docs for you. So if you were to say generate the Java doc, it will actually put this information in your documentation so that somebody knows what these parameters are used for. Okay, so this is a constructor, the cell phone. It matches the same name as your class. And you can see here that has 3 arguments that you're going to have. 3 parameters, I should say. I don't have the arguments to actually supply the information, but these are the 3 parameters. And those 3 parameters are going to set these instance fields that you have up here. So the man variable is going to set this manufact variable that I have, and the mod variable is going to set the model, and the price is going to set the retail price. And as I said before, it's good not to have the same name because it makes it confusing. Like if I were to have the same name here, that makes it confusing here as to which one you're talking about, okay? Because it doesn't know if you're talking about this one or you're talking about the top level one. And then you have to start saying like this dot manufact to get the right one. It just makes it a little trickier than you need to do, okay? So if you give it a different name, it makes it easier to understand what you're talking about, okay? So this is the data coming in when you create the object, and then this sets the actual variables you have here. So if you take a look at the driver here, you can see that there's actually a scanner here that's going to ask you the questions for these 3 pieces of information. So what's the manufacturer, model, and retail price? It's going to take that data and save it in these 3 variables, test man, test mod, and test price. And then it's going to create the object down here. And so this object name is going to be phone 1, and it's going to pass in those 3 pieces of data into the creation of the object so that it saves that data. So test man, whatever you type in for the manufacturer, is going to be your test man, and same thing for test mod and test price. And that's going to go over here and actually go into your constructor. So you see you have 3 parameters, and over here I have 3 arguments. And I don't have that information until I run it and actually put that information in. So enter the manufacturer, I'll just say ABC, XYZ is the model, and it's going to cost $400. Okay, and then it prints it back out for me. But that information that I typed in is going in here, and then I have down here the getters and setters. Let's skip to the getters. So the getter is going to return the information about the variable. So you see I have that variable up here. So whenever I did the constructor, it set all those variables for me. So when I say get manufact, it's going to return the manufacturer, and get model. And you can see that none of these have parameters, and that's because they don't need information from you to be able to retrieve what's already in the object. But you need to have the return type here instead of having void. This manufacturer one's going to return a string, model returns a string, and then the retail price one returns a double. And they all have returns because the getters return information. Okay, so when I do over here, when I do my getters here, that's just what printed my information for me. So up here I typed it in. Here I created the object with the information I typed in, and then here I printed, using my getters, the information that was saved in the phone 1 object. So far so good? Okay, I'll take that as a yes, hopefully.
Makes
Yeah.
sense to me.
Okay, perfect. I can't tell if that's I'm completely lost or if this is too easy. So thanks. Okay, thank you. So I do have setters, and you might be wondering, why do I have setters? It's good to have setters for your variables so that you can change them. So because I have a constructor that allows me to set my 3 properties, I might not need the setters, I might not use them, but if I want to change the manufacturer of the phone, let's say I made a mistake, or maybe we re-engineer the phone and we have a different manufacturer now, we can do that with a setter. But one thing you definitely want to have is the retail price, because that can change, right? So you can have one price and then you can change the price. So having a setter, when you first created the object, you had set the price, but having a setter allows you to change the price. So if I were to go over here and say, for example, here I printed off the retail price, but let's see here I want to change the price. So I'm going to say phone one dot set retail price, and I'm going to pass in, let's say it raises it to $4.50, or maybe we'll put it on sale for $3.50. Okay, so then I'm going to print this again so you can see the change. So when I first initially do it, I'm going to do my same data, ABC, XYZ, and I'm going to have $400. So it starts off at $400. Nobody's buying the phone, so we change it to $300, and now it prints $350. So now it's $350. So I can use the setters to modify the properties of the object. If I don't have setters, I can't change them. Once the object's created, you can't ever modify them unless you make the variables public. Okay, so if you have questions, just put it in the chat and I can answer your questions. Yes, you don't have to have the setter. Yeah, it's not required. Then that means that nobody can change it. If you don't have a setter, and if your variables are private and you don't have a setter, you can't change that property. But that's okay. Maybe it's something that shouldn't change. So maybe you don't want to have a setter. But you have to make sure, if you don't have a setter, you have to make sure that you have a constructor that sets the property when you first create the object. Because remember, you don't have to have a constructor either. The constructor is optional, because if you don't put a constructor on there, there'll be a default constructor which won't do anything, won't set any of your properties. And so if you don't have a constructor and you don't have a setter, then that property never gets set. And it'll just initialize it at whatever. If it's an integer, it'll just initialize it at 0, for example. So you don't want to have things that are just initialized because you never set them. So make sure you have a constructor that sets them, or you have a setter that sets them, or if you want to be able to set them at first and then modify them later, having both would be great, having a constructor and having setters. And your book talks about having multiple constructors, having overloaded constructors. It's the same thing as having overloaded methods. Remember, a constructor is just a method. It just gives you the choice of doing it a different way. So like if you're creating a cell phone and maybe you don't have the price yet, but you have the manufacturer and the model, but you don't have the price, but you want to go ahead and create the cell phone, you can have a constructor, you can overload this so that it wouldn't have a price. And then what you do is just take this off of here, okay? And then that price would get initialized at 0. Or you can actually put that in there. You can actually put whatever retail price you want to initialize it as. You can put retail price equals 0 if you want, or you can leave it off. So this would give you the option when you're creating the object to just pass in these two pieces of information as your arguments and leave off the price. And so the more ways that you do your constructor, the more options you have when you're creating the option. But what that means is that you probably should, when you figure out the price, go do the setter for the price to get the right price. So that you just need to remember to set it. Okay? So there's a lot of options depending on what you're doing, whether you have setters and getters for everything, or you have constructors or multiple constructors. So you just have to think about what it is you're doing and what works for your scenario. Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. So again, I could create one that doesn't have a price. Another thing I can do is if I don't want to go through the scanner and everything and I want to create a cell phone, I just put the name of the class, the name I want to give the object equals new cell phone. Now it is possible to just say cell phone, phone 2, semicolon, and not create the object. So when you do equals new, when you do this part, you're actually creating the object. This part is actually just defining the object. You're saying you're going to have a cell phone object called phone 2 with the name phone 2, I should say. This part actually creates the phone. And so I can create a phone with whatever data I want. And then I can pass in that information. So I could say like Android Pixel, are we on Pixel 4? I think. Okay. I don't have to put in a price if I don't want to, because I have that other constructor that I don't have a price variable for. But you know, if I know it, I should put it there. So it puts it in as a value, because otherwise I have to go set the retail price later so that I have a price for it. But if I wanted to print this data, I could just change this here to be, let's change this, to be phone 2. I'm gonna have a little problem here because I didn't set it. I have to enter, oh, you know what? I'm just gonna put data in here because I have it doing it, but it doesn't really matter what I put because I'm not using that phone right now to print. But see how the Android Pixel is 0 because I never set the price. So a default initializes to 0. And you probably don't want to leave it like that. Probably want to set the price. So if I want to, I can put it here when I create it, or I can do the setter for it since I use this constructor. So I can just do a setter phone 2. Just, it tells me about it, so I can just put it here. What does it cost? Maybe it's $300. And then it will print the $300. And I still have the scanner in there asking me these questions, so I'm just going to put some data in there. So here you can see that that phone is $300 now that I set it, where I could just put that price in up here. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mhm.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
So what I want to do, I want to show you something that might have been confusing. One thing that your book talks about, the main thing it talks about in this chapter is how to create a UML diagram, how to do setters and getters in constructor. But the other thing you have to know is how to pass in an object. So there was a couple examples, I believe, that had you passing in an object, but I'm going to do a simple example down here of a method that just does the printing. So this is just going to be a static method that prints the info for us. Instead of printing it up here, I'm going to print it down here. And in order to print information about the phone, I'm going to have to pass in a phone object. Okay, so I'm going to call that object P. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to, oh, this is void, sorry. I'm going to move this information that I had for printing down here. Okay, now, oh, cell phone, sorry. Cell phone, P. So P is a cell phone object. And then instead of saying, I'm going to put a price here on this just to make it easier. Instead of saying phone 2 here, does anybody know what I can refer to that as now?
P.
P, good. Because I don't know what phone it's going to be. It'll be whatever phone I pass in when I call the method. So P is just the generic variable name here that's going to represent whatever phone I pass in. So when I do this method print info, I'm going to pass in a cell phone, and it's going to do all this with whatever cell phone I pass in. So it might be phone 1, it might be phone 2, it might be a newly created phone that I just created. But we only have 2 phones for this, unless you want to create more. So I'm going to call the print info method, and I'm going to pass in phone 2. Okay. And so what's going to happen is phone 2 is going to get passed into P, which is type cell phone. So it knows that it's a cell phone object. And then it can do all these methods on the cell phone object. So the cell phone object phone 2 is storing all the data that we put in there when we created it. So this data that I put in here is stored in phone 2, but it also has access to these methods that are part of the cell phone class. So if I run this, it's still going to ask me about my data for phone 1. And I can just put something in there. I'm not really using phone 1. So I'm just putting some data in there. So see, it still does the same thing. It's just doing it from a different method. But I wanted to show you that we were doing methods last chapter, and we were, you know, mainly doing primitives, but you do strings, and strings are objects. So you were passing in objects when you do a string. But now we're working with objects that, classes that we created and using those objects. So this is actually saying, hey, I have a parameter P that's type cell phone. The type is cell phone. So when you pass in the object here, it has to be a cell phone type. Okay. So I can pass in phone 1 if I want to. Oops. I could do both. I could do print of info for both of them. I could do ABC. It doesn't have to be the same thing each time too, but just staying consistent. And then I can maybe do it again if you wanted. Okay, let's do it for phone 2. Now that we have it, we don't have to keep repeating that data, those lines of code. So just call it A, B, 400. Okay, so I guess I like the number 400, but I think that's what phones about. It's about that, right? Phones are about $400 or so. Pretty expensive, maybe like 200 now. Some of them, like the Pixel, I think they're expensive. Anyways.
Apple phones.
Okay, so I can do the information for both. Does that make sense to everybody, what I did here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Anybody have any questions about the chapter? Any problems you run into? Anything in this example or in the Kahoot game? Anything that you were a little confused about? Okay, so this chapter is just starting off a little basic. Some of it might be complicated to understand, but it's going to keep building on it. So if something in the chapter is confusing you, it just doesn't make sense. If you're still stuck on the word static or void or any of this when you're writing it, it's going to keep coming back to haunt you because it's not going away. And we're going to keep building on this. Like this is the start of us talking about object-oriented concepts, but we're going to keep adding to it. Like right now, we just have this one cell phone class, but we're going to start adding more classes that extend those classes. So we might have like an upper level class and then lower level classes that extend that. And then we're going to start talking about interfaces and abstract classes and abstract interclasses and all these wonderful things that'll make your code do more powerful things. But right now we're just kind of basic, but if something is confusing you, please, if you don't want to ask during the class session, that's okay. But please schedule an appointment to meet with me and clarify it, clear it up, because I don't want it to keep coming back because it's not going to go away. So just don't hesitate to schedule an appointment. And I can hopefully go through that with you so that it makes sense. So, and yes, I saw that some people are posting in the chat that they just came in, and that's fine. But yes, please don't forget to post in the chat if you come in late, because when I go through, I'm going to go through again when I put you in breakout rooms, but I may have missed you and I want to just make sure I give you credit for being here. Okay, so what we're going to do is break out into a breakout session. Okay, thank you. All right. And you may have already done this for the discussion board, but you probably didn't do pet, although maybe somebody did. We're going to do a UML diagram for a pet, and you might be saying what type of pet? Well, that's one of the actual properties that you can put in there. So like you might name your UML diagram pet, your class might be pet, and then your properties, your instance fields, one of them might be type, for example, and I would put type as a string because what type of pet are you talking about? Are you talking about a pig, a dog, a cat? What type of pet? And then you can get more specific, like, what's the name of your pet? And so what are some attributes that you'd have with your pet? Those will be your instance fields. So I want you to think about it as a group and come up with some fields that you would have and make sure you mark them as public or private and you put the data type for those and follow the right capitalization. And then I want you to implement that. So we'll also have the methods, sorry. You have your instance methods, so your getters and your setters for each of the fields that you created. And it's probably good to have a constructor that sets them at the beginning, but also have setters and getters for each of the properties that you have. And if you think anything else is interesting that you want to add as an instance method, you can do that. But this is just the basic part that I want you to do. Just have the properties, the constructor, and the setters and the getters for that pet. Okay, so do your diagram first. You can use Notepad if you want to, or you can use Word. Somebody that has that's on their computer that can share it should take over for this one. so that you can be typing and you can all be contributing. And then if you could use NetBeans or Eclipse because they work better for projects for this particular one, you'll be able to create a class that you can implement your UML diagram. And I would like you to create another class that's your driver that can actually, you can actually create your object and then test it. So just like I did here, I have the cell phone class. You can use this as an example. And then I have my main class here that has my main method. And you don't have to do all of the scanner. You can just create the objects. I could have just put this line in there and then just do some printing where you print it off to make sure it works. You do the getters to print it. Okay, now notice that your class that you're doing for your object doesn't have a main method. It's the one that's actually running and creating the object that has the main method. Okay, so let me see, there's something in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and break you into groups. Here, does everybody understand what you have to do?
Yes, I think so.